for this SIG event on supply chain. My name is Deborah DeVos. I belong to the special interest group of IMA, and I am here to introduce the event, give you some ground rules, and to also introduce our speaker. As most of you who have already attended our webinars are aware, we have some housekeeping rules. Please note that you are muted upon entry. Please use the Q&A that we have to ask questions and the attendee chat to interact. You may, if you have immediate technical questions, you can type it in the Q&A window for immediate assistance. We will do our best, or I would say Bill will do his best to answer your questions as we go along. And if you do have questions, as we said, please put them in the chat, and I'll get into that in a little bit. You will see that there are polling questions which will appear. If you do not see the poll question appear, please refresh your internet browser. That could be the reason. A copy of the presentation will be available for download under related content. Again, to receive full CPE credit, you must attend the entire presentation, answer all polling questions, and ideally complete the evaluation form. It's optional but encouraged. The link to the recording will be emailed to attendees along with a link to download your CPE credit about 1 hour after the webcast. And I will just take this opportunity to mention IMA's special interest group or shared interest groups. There are different ones on small business, on small business, on ethics, and this one that is bringing you the presentation today is the performance management shared interest group. Please consider joining our group. We have these webinars, we have different events, and we have conversations on the IMA website, which could be interesting to you. And I go to the next slide. So again, you can scan this code and it'll bring you directly to the page to register. The performance management SIG seeks to provide thought leadership and a forum to exchange ideas and best practices around performance management. Please note also that as a follow-up to this webinar with Bill, we will have a roundtable in about a week on June 17th. I think Bill will mention this at the end. So yes, registration is free and it's free for everyone. So we would be thrilled to have you there. Without further ado, I would like to present our speaker today, Bill Lee, who is here. And with that, I will hand over the floor to him. Over to you, Bill.
Very good. Thank you, Deborah. I appreciate that. So good morning, good evening, wherever you happen to be in the world. I'd like to give you a little bit of background today. This is the agenda that I've put together for today's webinar, and I've used this format that we found to be very successful in some of the companies that I've worked in. I call it a PPO, and it stands for Purpose, Why Are We Meeting? Process, which is the effective agenda, and outcome, and that's what I hope that you get today. So the purpose, I'm trying to provide some information based on my experiences working on both sides of the supply chain. I should say both sides of the fence. I've worked in finance for many years. I've worked in supply chain for many years. And what I want to do is share some of that experience that I've had. We'll go through some definitions to start. I'll talk about the different time horizons that the supply chain puts together its business plans. We'll talk about performance trade-offs in the supply chain, decisions that have to be made. And I'll finally end up with what I call some recommended levers for finance to consider to become much more effective partners with their supply chain partners in their organizations to become more effective at driving business performance. And the outcome from today is a high hope that you as a participant will gain some insights on how you can improve how you partner with supply chain to drive improved performance. So with that, let's get into it. Let me give you just a real quick information about my background. I do have deep experience in some finance, supply chain, and business strategy. I started my career at Deloitte. That's where I obtained my CPA. I worked at Deloitte in the Chicago office in audit, tax, and consulting. I also worked for almost 30 years for a global consumer products company. And in that time, I worked in corporate financial planning and analysis, manufacturing financial planning and analysis. And then, as they like to say, I got a real job. I got a career development opportunity to move over to supply chain. I've led a business transformation. And when I left that organization, I was responsible for strategy in Europe and North America. I'm also a certified business process master. I had the luxury to work with Dr. Michael Hammer while he was still alive. If you don't know Dr. Hammer, I suggest maybe that you take the opportunity to Google him. He was the father of re-engineering. In fact, he wrote a book called Re-Engineering the Corporation. I've also become a change management coach using General Electric's change acceleration process. And finally, and this is kind of unique, is that I actually taught supply chain management at a top 10 American graduate school of business that was Marquette University in Milwaukee. So for a non-supply chain person to teach in the master's program in supply chain was kind of unique. So that said, I want to base my presentation today on things that I've learned through my career. But one of the things I like to do always is start any discussion of the supply chain with some definitions. And the reason I like to do this is that based on my experience, when I've gone into a group of people and asked them to define supply chain for me, if there's 20 people in the room, I get 20 different answers. So I'm going to give you my perspective, okay? So the way I view a supply chain, it is a physical network of resources that are actually operated to deliver products to customers. And the network extends over on the far left side from what I would call your supplier, all the way up to the end user. And everything in between is all part of the supply chain. Now, a lot of people define supply chain as they think of it as logistics, warehousing, transportation. Yep, those are all part of it. But the way I want to talk about supply chain today is the entire scope. Now, I've given these little boxes here to show that supply chain, you go from your supplier to a raw material supplier, to a manufacturing facility, to a distribution center, or a depot, as my friends in Europe like to call them, to the customer and to the end user. This is a very simple layout of a supply chain. Most supply chains are a lot more complex. In fact, the network extends to many manufacturing facilities, sometimes hundreds and thousands of suppliers, multiple distribution centers. And if you're working on a global basis, it gets very complicated very quickly. Now, the next definition I want to talk about is supply chain management. Now, I like to think of it as you've got all the activities involved in coordinating three types of flows that take place across the chain. So your first flow is what I call demand communication. Now you notice that I didn't use the word forecast, I used demand communication. And what you're trying to do is you're communicating the demand at each aspect or each part of the supply chain. And what are you communicating? You're communicating what's required, what's the quantity required, where is it required, when is it required. It's kind of like journalism questions, who, what, when, where, why. So, but this data flows from the end user backwards through the supply chain all the way back to supplier. Now that data gets adjusted and communicated so that it matches up with what's required to move the next flow, which is physical flow. But I want to say a couple of things about demand. And this is something that when I moved into supply chain, my people on my team were very smart, and they were quite effective at helping me to understand things that I never understood as a financial person. For example, the difference between independent and dependent demand. Your final shipments to your customers represent independent demand, and that's driven. Well, I'd say it's independent demand because that demand is driven by all kinds of factors going on in the marketplace: consumer interest, competitive situation, economic environment. But dependent demand is upstream in the supply chain, and that demand depends on what's happening at the next stage in the supply chain. So for example, if I look at the demand for raw materials, well, that depends on the scheduled production at a manufacturing facility. So it's not independent at all. It's very much dependent. Now, something to keep in mind, and the reason for that distinction is there's a lot of discussion these days, as almost everyone knows, about AI and all the different AI applications and how can they be used in the supply chain. Keep in mind that AI will not know all the things that you know in your supply chain, okay? And that involves things like your business strategy, your production, your product plans for the future. AI doesn't know those things, but you do. And so it's very important to keep in mind when you're considering how to use AI. Now, again, I mentioned this second flow, and that's what I call physical movement flow, and that flows in the opposite direction. That's moving, raw materials and component parts from your supplier to your raw material supplier, who in turn moves them to your manufacturing facility, who in turn produces them and converts them into a saleable format. Then they move them into the distribution network, and then finally shipping them to a customer who makes them available for an end user. Now, in between all these different boxes is inventory, okay? And the other thing that connects these boxes is typically transportation. So the final flow that we need to manage in the supply chain is cash. In other words, everyone needs to be paid. That's kind of a duh. Everyone knows that. And the other thing is that while everyone needs to be paid, and accurate records, by the way, play a very pivotal role here, the payment flow is not purely continuous. In other words, an end user will pay the customer, who pays the distribution organization or the brand manufacturer on regard to their payment terms. So with that as kind of a starting point, let's talk about performance. And after all, this special shared interest group is really all about performance. And although the title of this presentation was Integrated Business Planning, at the end of the day, from my perspective, the key benefit of integrated business planning is not, that we got our numbers to be the same. That's a nicety. But at the end of the day, can we collaborate to drive business performance? So in the supply chain, what the supply chain is trying to do is trying to increase velocity, whether it's moving data or moving goods. The supply chain strives for accuracy. Your inventory numbers need to be accurate. Your demand numbers need to be accurate. You want to be timely. These days we live in what I call a customer economy, where customers call the shots in terms of what their expectations are. And what it is mostly, they want their products on time. They want to be reliable. We want our supply chain to be reliable in its performance and efficient. And this is where the cost information really comes in. And the final aspect of performance is, we need to be damage-free as much as possible. Now, it's time for our first polling question. And hopefully, if you were listening, this should be very easy. So which of the following is not one of those three flows that I talk about as being part of supply chain management? Is it A, demand communication, B, physical movements, C, workforce scheduling, or D, cash payments? So take a little bit of time and plug in your answers. And we've got over half of the group so far that's responded. Let's see how the answers are coming in.
Yeah.
Which one is not? Well, actually, workforce scheduling is not one of the three flows that I mentioned. Demand communication was flow number 1, physical movements was flow number 2, and cash payments was flow number 3. Now, if I've talked about the attributes that a supply chain is trying to achieve, well, a high-performing supply chain, these things will be very evident and present in a high-performing supply chain. Let me just quickly go through them. Robust supplier management. That's selecting and managing suppliers that offer you as the manufacturer high-quality, reliable products and services while optimizing costs and reducing supply chain risk. Now, I just used a term that I'm going to use a lot this morning or this afternoon, and that is optimize. And it was one of the things that I learned after I made the transition from finance to supply chain is that, the supply chain people made me strike the word minimize from my vocabulary. And they said it's all about optimizing, and that's because of the trade-offs that have to be considered. I'm going to talk about those in a minute. The second attribute is effective inventory management. And that's managing inventory levels to optimize. There's that optimize word again. Customer service while optimizing carrying costs and reducing the risk of stockouts. And that's obviously where the inventory is not available to be either sold or moved to the next point of the supply chain. Lean manufacturing is also an attribute of a high-performing supply chain. And what I mean by lean manufacturing, and a lot of people use different terms here, but these are principles that are used to streamline operations, where you're reducing waste wherever possible and optimizing, there's that word again, production efficiency. Okay, efficient logistics and transportation. Again, now you're optimizing the movement of goods through the supply chain so that you're able to minimize the lead times that the customers need to provide to order products, reduce costs, and improve customer service. Collaborative planning and demand communication. To be candid, this is one of my favorites. In fact, I've got a book that I'm writing that this is one of the key features is collaboration mindset. And what I mean by collaborative planning is you're working closely, well, first and foremost, inside your organization. So you're collaborating between the teams, between manufacturing and distribution and engineering and product development and sales and marketing. But in fact, I'm going to give you a quick example here of what happens when you do not effectively collaborate. We were working on a situation where we're starting up a new business in Europe, actually. And so I can't give too many specific details other than to say that one of the things that's unique in the consumer goods industry in Europe is that many shipments are made with products on pallets. But the challenge in Europe is at this time, there were at least three different pallet standards. And by three different pallet standards, I'm talking about the physical dimensions of the pallet, which define how the products need to be configured to ship on that pallet so that it makes it on the truck or lorry to their end user. Well, I went to the manufacturing facility that we were constructing in the north of England. And the project manager was talking about how he was collaborating with finance to reduce or manage the cost of the capital cost of this project. Because as we were walking down the production line, I noticed that we got to the end of the line and there were palletizers situated right as the product comes off the line. And I said, the gentleman's name was Don. I said, Don, why did you put these here? And he said, oh, I saved $100,000 per line by putting this palletizer right here. This is great. It's helping me manage the project cost. I said, oh, who suggested that? Well, the finance guys, because they were helping me to minimize the capital cost of the project. Well, that's good. But I said, did you know that we've got to organize this production on at least 3 different pallet standards? And because we're brand new in the marketplace, I will guarantee you that we are going to get the actual distribution of product by pallet configuration wrong. In other words, we're going to have to reconfigure the product on the pallets to match where the true demand is. And we will spend, I'm thinking, 3 to 4 times what you saved in capital in operating costs, and it's going to affect our margins. And he just said, oh, nobody told me that. Well, the point was nobody thought to ask the question. But it's an example of why collaborative activity is so important. Now, a high-performance supply chain will actually collaborate with key customers and key suppliers so that your communication is being effective and clear back and forth. It's helping you to make more effective, manages your on-time ability, manages your product availability, your inventories. It's just so much benefit from doing that. And the last couple of things are you've got to be data-driven in your decision-making. There's a lot of decisions that have to be made, and we're going to go through some of those in a couple of minutes. But you can't make decisions based on gut, although it's tempting. And finally, you have to have a continuous improvement mindset, that you're always striving to be better. There's, things change so much in today's economy and business world that you've got to keep ahead of the game. So I mentioned trade-off decisions. I'm not going to read all these. I'll let you read it, but I will just kind of go through them quickly. One of the key trade-offs is cost versus speed. If you want to move, remember I said that velocity was one of the things you're striving for in the supply chain, which means you want to be fast. But velocity, from what my engineering friends tell me, is speed plus direction. So you don't want to be shipping things to yourself and then shipping things to yourself again before you finally ship it to a customer. You've got to be very mindful. There's a classic trade-off of what's people call inventory. Do I carry more inventory, or do I reduce my inventory and take a risk in not having product available for customers? Conventional wisdom is that the more you invest in inventory, the better you'll be able to service your customer orders. However, there's a challenge to that. If you invest too much in inventory, the carrying cost may erode your profit margin and prevent you from achieving your business goals. Also, there is a decision that supply chain teams have to make is, do I develop my plans on a centralized basis? In other words, do everything from headquarters? Or do I do a decentralized plan? Flexibility versus efficiency. A highly efficient supply chain may be optimized for a very specific product, but may not be as adaptable to changes in demand or new products. So again, that's a trade-off that you've got to consider. Inventory versus lead time. Again, reducing inventory levels can decrease cost, but may increase lead times and reduce customer satisfaction. And then there's the quality versus cost. And this is what I'm going to do a little shame on me from my experience when I was in finance. When I was in finance, we used to be recommending to the purchasing organization that we're always trying to minimize acquisition cost of product, of materials. But what I found out was that so many materials, particularly those that become part of a finished product, can have either a positive or negative impact on your production efficiency. And if you ignore that impact while you're making your sourcing decision, that in your effort of striving to get the lowest cost, you actually might be making your manufacturing cost much worse. So there's a lot of trade-off decisions that have to be made. And my message for finance people in the room, which I think is a lot of folks, and by the way, if we have supply chain people. A lot of the things that I talk about from a supply chain standpoint, most supply chain people pretty much know backwards and forward, but this should give you an opportunity to have a conversation with your finance partners to say, how can we help each other? Now, I wanted to include this slide because while I'm not going to talk about all the metrics that are involved in managing the supply chain, in fact, I taught an entire semester-long course in supply chain metrics when I was teaching in my master's program. So I don't have time to get out all of them, but what I wanted to highlight is when we think about business performance, and I use this little triangle here to make a point, no pun intended, about supply chain sitting literally at the apex of this pyramid. Okay, and that's because in the supply chain, you're constantly managing these trade-offs between, on the left-hand side of the pyramid, I call it customer performance, and on the right-hand side is company performance. On the customer performance side, you've got metrics like perfect order percentage, or OTF stands for on time in full percentage. You're trying to manage delivery. You're trying to get the right items to the right place at the right time to meet the customer's expectations. You've got quality management to consider, product performance and damage free. But on the company side, you've got an obligation to do a really good job managing the assets under your influence, and that's your investments in inventory, your capacity utilization, your margin management, your product costs, your transportation and storage. There the metrics include things like your return on assets, your total delivered cost, cash to cash cycle days. And like I said, imagine yourself at the top of this pyramid. If you lean too far to one side, if you lean too far to make your customers happy, you're going to suffer your profit margin. If you lean too far to make your chief financial officer happy, well, you may end up losing customers. So to understand how to help the supply chain make these trade-off decisions, it's really important that you understand your business strategy, your competitive environment, the marketplace you're working in, so that you can be more effective in helping the supply chain make decisions. Now, the other thing, because of integrated business planning, a lot of times we're talking about trying to get on the same page between the supply chain plan and financial plans and forecasts. And these are the typical time horizons that supply chain planning team develops operating plans. The execution horizon, which is on the far left, you'll see at the bottom of this graphic, you're going to see the executional plan is developed in days. And at this point, you're looking ahead for maybe the next, and every company is a little bit different in terms of what these exact time horizons are. In many consumer products companies, it's probably around 3 to 5 to 7 days. And you're trying to make sure that you're in position to make sure that these orders can be met. Your tactical planning horizon, now you're starting to look anywhere from 2 to 17 or 18 weeks into the future. And now you're looking for opportunities to optimize where you make your products. You're trying to optimize the scheduling of production. And in fact, what the supply chain team is typically doing at this point is develop what they call a master production schedule. This isn't a final schedule, but it's a pretty good evaluation of the resources required. And typically you're looking at data in weekly or monthly buckets. But then as you move into the strategic horizon, now you're looking at anywhere from 3 quarters out to maybe 3 to 5 years, depending on what your business plans. And now you're looking at production capacity, and you're trying to evaluate whether or not existing capacity is adequate to meet what's in the business plan. And this often leads to recommendations for capital investment. So it's a great place for finance to connect and support these recommendations, because you have to make things like make versus buy decisions. You'll have to understand, what's a unit of capacity worth and how much investment do we have to make. So again, the business output you're trying to drive is in your executional horizon. You want to be able to make sure that your orders can be shipped on time and complete. In your strategic horizon, the demand for what's in this horizon is coming from your strategic business plan. A lot of companies are making at least 1 year plans out, oftentimes 3 to 5 years, and some are even going out 10. But your supply is going to come from your current practical capacity and any capital plans for changes in that capacity. So when I talk about aligning between finance and supply chain, keep in mind that supply chain plans represent the best available view of the business's upcoming sales, production, inventories. Okay, so if you really want to know what's going to happen, that's the place to go to look. It's not going to your sales organization, although I've seen a lot of companies go to the sales organization. What sales will typically tell you is what their objective is. Well, here's my forecast. I'm going to deliver my objective. And you find that typically your supply chain takes that into consideration, but also tends to be a bit more realistic. Realistic rather than optimistic. Remember, these plans are really driving that production. And keep in mind, execution plans are going to be most detailed at the SKU level, stock keeping unit level by week. Now, when you're in this time horizon, you're not likely to influence outcomes now. You're just trying to make sure things happen. So one of the things that when I was in the finance organization, a big consumer products company, they used to call the finance FP&A guys, the guys that come in, the guys and gals that come in, and after the battle is over, their phrase was they bayonet the wounded. In other words, they come in and hurt the team that just made the mistakes. And what my suggestion is, don't be the team bayoneting the wounded. You might need to help people learn from mistakes, but at the other end of the day, try as much as possible to be proactive. Get out in front. I'm going to talk about lead times here in a second. Get out in front of these decisions so that you can use your knowledge to really be an effective business partner. Now, that's one of the reasons why I talk about time and how important time is in the supply chain. It really is, when you're planning your supply chain detail, it's one of the most important considerations in planning. You've got lead times, and that's the time it takes between when you can place an order until that resource is available. And those lead times will apply to a lot of things. It's not just, when your customer has to submit an order. It's when you have to submit an order for supply. It's when you have to make labor changes. Say, for example, you're in that tactical capacity planning stage where you're trying to optimize the use of all your productive capacity. Well, some of that might mean that to better your demand, it might be shifting geographically. And you want to move the production to a facility that's much closer to the end demand. Well, you may not have enough labor to meet all the demand that you want to place on that site. So you've got to know what your lead time is. So how fast can I add another crew, for example, on a production line? How fast, what's it going to take for me to make capacity changes? Sometimes these capacity changes are related to capability. Now, let me explain a little bit what I mean by that. Every production line has the capability designed into that line to make a certain type of product. In many cases, the capability that production line can produce extends way more than just one SKU. Now, some are dedicated and will make one SKU, but many lines, at least the ones I've worked with, can make, maybe 10s, 20, maybe even 100 different variations of products. So you've got to understand the lead time it takes to convert that production line to be able to make the products that you need to make. Another important thing is your transit time. This is the time between when your order gets loaded till the time the order is actually delivered to that next point of the supply chain. And this really varies a lot by transportation mode. So in the US, we talk a lot about truckload, less than truckload, intermodal, air shipments, ocean freight shipments, partial shipments. Each one of these, has a very different transit time. So for example, if you're If you're a global organization and you've got raw materials being sourced from one part of the world and they need to come to another part of the world, well, now you've got to make decisions about what's the most appropriate mode. Should these items be shipped by air, which is very expensive but very fast, or should they be placed on an ocean carrier, in which place you'll reduce the cost, but it's going to take a long time to cross the ocean to get it to where you need it to be. And then not only that, but then there's a lot of other challenges in shipping that. But again, it's very important to understand those things. And one of the things too that I learned about transportation, which, after I learned it, it became obvious. But before I learned it, I just really was kind of ignorant about it. I used to think that transportation was like a factor of rate times time equals distance. And if you had to ship maybe across the US or across the European continent, well, it might cost you more to ship a longer distance. Well, that may be true. It may not be true. In fact, what I learned about transportation is it's a very tricky analysis to understand the true dynamics of what drives your transportation cost. And a lot of times it's not what you think it is. It's not distance. It might be that a particular carrier provider that's going to provide transportation may have a strong need to move some of their equipment into a certain market. And therefore they might offer you on a particular lane, and a lane is an origin and a destination pair. And you might find that, well, that may be a long distance. You might get a cheap rate because they need to get their capacity there. Again, the more you understand as a finance team about what's going on here, and this is where, particularly in a large organization, you really want to spend time with your transportation folks to understand this. And finally, flow time, and that's the time it takes to move materials and products inside a facility. I've been in manufacturing facilities that have been so complicated that when you receive raw materials in the receiving dock, and then you have to store them somewhere, and then by the time you need them on the production line, you've got to move them, physically move them. You need to get your materials handling teams involved to move them to the production line so that they're available to support your production plan. Some of these facilities are laid out very efficiently, and some are not. And you've got to understand this when you start to think about all the time required that you need to move. Again, the more you understand about what's actually going on in your supply chain, the more effective you will be as a finance person and developing a partnership. Now, this is a little bit of a busy slide, but I want to talk about for a few minutes about how the supply chain views capacity. And although every organization may use different terminology, what I'm showing on this particular slide here is, I don't know if I can draw this, but you'll see over here on the far left-hand side, there's a bar that's labeled theoretical capacity. And what that is looking at the number of units that you can produce at the design speed if you operate that capacity 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. So that's your theoretical maximum capacity. But the next bar over represents what I call practical capacity. And that's really the capacity that's available to schedule production. And one of the most important measures here is, the machine hours available. And you want to develop this practical capacity, you have to look at how many machine hours are available times your reliable production rate. And where do you get the reliable production rate from? You come all the way over here, and you have to consider that once you've scheduled your production and you actually start producing, you actually start to experience what I call process reliability losses. The first process reliability loss is speed. The average speed that production line runs might be lower than that design speed. So that's a loss. Oh, by the way, waste happens. Although some of you might be perfect, although I haven't seen one yet, but when you have unsaleable product that whether it's you have to kick it off the line or it gets to the end of the line and has to be scrapped. Well, that's a real process reliability loss. And the final major category of process reliability loss is delay. If that line has to be shut down, whether it's because of bad materials, something got stuck in the process, the manufacturing process somewhere, you had to shut the line down. Again, that's a reliability loss. And one of the things that's important is that you understand, in fact, and then over at the far right-hand side is what I call net good production, and that's what I call your realized capacity. So you may have started out hoping to schedule production for this practical capacity. What you actually got was your realized capacity. So a couple of things that I wanted to share. Number one, so when you look at, let's see if I can draw this here with a pen. I don't know if people can see a little red circle that I put around this arrow labeled A. That's the difference between theoretical and practical capacity. So people ask me, well, what's the difference? Well, the difference is this. Number one, a lot of times, depending on your business strategy and your business plan, you may intentionally not want to schedule production because you may need to reserve production time to rebuild capacity to make maybe a new product. So as you're developing launch plans for a new product or improved products, part of that launch planning is you've got to step back and understand how is this going to affect my current capacity? Do I have to take it out of production? In which case, that's not available to use to make saleable inventory. So that could part of the cost. Some of it might be for planned maintenance. A lot of times, in order to keep productive capacity running at the levels that you need it to run, you've got to stop, take a time out, as it were, and actually do maintenance. A lot of companies do a really good job of what I call preventive maintenance. In other words, take the production line down, oil it, change parts, whatever you need to do to make sure it stays in 100% operating condition. So that's what accounts for that gap. Another thing that I put a couple of pro tips in here. I talked about these process reliability losses. And one of the things I would encourage your finance organization and your supply chain organization to do, be sure you're collecting data. And when I say collect data, collect your numbers on what are your speed loss? What is your average rate? What is your waste percentage? And how much delay time you're experiencing for a couple of reasons. One, it will help you calculate what your reliable production rate is to get the inventory you need. But secondly, if the finance team is involved, this will help that you will have the data that you can use to justify investing in improvement initiatives. In other words, how can I reduce these reliability losses? One, it'll improve my cost. And second, it'll improve my available capacity. In fact, I'll give you an example. In one of the businesses that I worked in, when I started my supply chain journey in this business, we had 7 production facilities with 46 production lines in this business that we had to schedule. Well, the manufacturing team, the supply chain team, and the finance team all partnered together to figure out how could we improve process reliability. And over a period of 5 years, we improved that process reliability so much so that that same business could produce 1.5 times the output of 46 machines with 23 machines. You heard that right. You took your productive capacity out, you cut it in half by machine count, but productive capacity was actually 1.5 times that. And what the business did was we were able to consolidate capacity in different facilities. We lowered our overhead costs. We improved our ability to service markets. And we were able to take that capacity and move it to our businesses overseas to help them invest in starting up a new business in that same category around the world. Amazing. I mean, the financial results were just unreal. But again, that's where I'm coming back to collaboration again. Understanding these things and understanding what impact it can have was just phenomenal. And finally, I'm going to leave you one more pro tip, and that's finance and supply chain planning should be using the same, what I call date effective bill of materials. Some people call them a BOM, a BOM, for all products. So when I say that, let me give you another story. I was working for another company that sourced a lot of raw materials and component parts from the Far East and Asia. And they were being sourced into the US for finished product manufacturing. But they were constantly having to air freight parts that they were shipping by ocean. Now, think of what that did to your cost. Remember I said earlier that air freighting is very expensive. It's fast, but it's very expensive. We started to dig into why is this happening all the time? Well, the reason we found out was both the supply chain and the finance organization were not using those process reliability losses when considering how much raw materials to order. In other words, they looked at the net engineering diagram that the product development team gave them and said, here's the net quantity that you need to actually make one unit of finished production. And then they backed it up and did the math and said, well, that's what I'll order. Well, the problem was waste happens and these reliability losses happen all the time. And of course, what was happening was the orders, they'd run out the inventory, couldn't support the planned production, then had, on an emergency basis, start to air freight costs. And it was like that happened so many times, we had to dig in to find out why. And once we did, it was like, duh, we should have thought about this. But that's why I'm giving us a pro tip. You know, your organization probably includes those factors, but if they're not, it's an opportunity for you. So other capacity considerations to think of, and this is one that I see a lot with talking with some of my finance colleagues. Beware what I call the fallacy of a 100% capacity utilization. And what I mean by that is a lot of people see it as an opportunity to minimize cost per unit. There's that bad word again, minimization. But the problem is operations will point out quickly that this causes problems. In fact, and the problems are going to hinder performance. Let me give you a little analogy that I'd like to share with people who are not involved in operations. Almost everybody, or at least for me, if this was true, when I get dressed in the morning, I have a drawer in my closet where I keep my socks. And usually when I open that drawer, it is filled to the brim with all the different socks that I own. However, almost always the socks that I need are not right on top. So to get to the socks that I need, I'm going to have to take a bunch of socks out of the drawer, find the ones I want, and then put all the socks back in. Think of all that energy it took. That doesn't sound like a lot, but now carry that over into a warehouse. If you get a warehouse that's at 100% utilization, you'll often find that puts your shipping and handling organization into what's called gridlock. And that's every place in the facility is filled up so much that there's no place to put new production coming in or new receipts coming in, or try to find the right product you need to ship. And all of a sudden you start driving up cost in that warehouse. Again, that's a problem created by trying or giving people objectives to try to manage 100% utilization, whether that's production capacity or warehouse capacity, transportation capacity, although transportation makes a little bit more sense because that's such short-term in nature. But the other thing, here's another thing that I learned the hard way, is capacity that's unused expires hour by hour. In other words, you don't get it back if you don't use it. So when I was a finance person trying to do forecasting for my business, we'd be looking ahead. Maybe in the first quarter, I'm trying to forecast my business for the next 3 quarters to get a full year forecast. Well, I look at the capacity utilizations. Oh, I didn't use it all in the first quarter. Oh, that means I can just use that much more in the second, third, and fourth quarters. No. And again, once it's like, it's so obvious once you learn that. But again, the supply chain and operations people know that all too well. But it's an opportunity for the finance people to learn it better. Here's a new way to think of inventory. Consider it stored capacity. In other words, I'm going to talk about the uses of inventory in just a minute, but if inventory is present, whether it's on the shop floor in terms of raw materials, it's in the warehouse in terms of finished product, it's available as capacity for you to sell. And I never thought about that, but again, my very smart supply chain team that worked on my team helped me. Sometimes they had to hit me over the head to understand it, but once I did, it was like, oh, now I get it. So that leads me to the next CPE question. So in supply chain management, inventory can be thought of as A, a liability that should always be eliminated, B, stored capacity, C, a fixed cost that cannot be managed, or D, an efficiency metric reported to shareholders.
Bill, thank you so much for introducing the second poll question. A couple of things. I think we need to give our participants a little bit more time than before, because they're very thorough in reading everything, so it's taking them a little bit more time. So now we have 163 of the 327 who have answered. And while we wait, I wanted to, 2 things. I think we need to just be aware that we have about 10 more minutes time. And also, we have some questions from our participants. One gentleman asked, Jean asked, what software should finance team use to enhance the data-driven skills and decision-making? So maybe you have some insight in that?
Well, fortunately or unfortunately, there are a number of different software applications that can be used. I would say, one, when you're looking at particularly product costs, I would like to ensure or recommend that people are giving consideration to software that allows them to do activity-based costing. Okay, because it's particularly when you have a broad product range. But I really didn't want to get into a specific recommendation today, although if somebody has questions, we can follow up later on specific applications.
All right. Then do we have another person, Alan? He was asking if EOQ, economic order quantity, is that still used today?
It still is, very much. And again, economic order quantity is the quantity that you're trading off, your transit time, your transportation costs, your inventory targets, and so on. So that helps you make a good, what I call data-driven decision on how much to order and at what point do you make that order. You're looking at your reorder point as well as the actual quantities. So good question.
Perfect. I think we can go to the answer now because we have most of everyone who has answered.
Yeah, and as 57% of the folks did zero in, it's stored capacity. That's that one point that I just made. So good job. The other thing that I wanted to share about insights, and again, this was something that I learned that was helpful, is that when you think about your total inventory, and just think about finished product inventory for a minute, I think of it as 3 different types of your inventory. You have a safety stock level, and that's giving you protection against variability of demand and supply. A lot of people think of it as only variability of demand, but it's actually variability of supply as well. So there's a joint variability that you have to consider. Cycle stock, that's inventory that's available for use that a product is not being produced. So for example, if you have a production line that can make 10 different SKUs, well, it can only make 1 SKU at a time, most production lines. So you need to be able to have inventory in the warehouse to ship when you're making the other, you have to have the other 9 SKUs in inventory while you're making the one. That's your cycle stock. And finally, your build stock is inventory that's built up to accommodate demand seasonality. You may be in a business where, the seasonality comes heavy in the fourth quarter, or strategic new product launch plans, or to allow for major production capacity rebuilds. These are all things, like I said, if you're trying to help your supply chain team understand inventory levels, and a lot of times it's when you're coming in evaluating their levels, you need to understand the business strategy and the current conditions. So here's a few things when I think about finance as a strategic partner for supply chain. I've identified what I call 6 strategic levers. So I'm going to go through these quickly in the interest of time. You've got, and they're 2 different colors because the ones that I would focus on first are your top level, your financial visibility, and that's your end-to-end cost transparency across your supply chain. I'm going to talk more about this in a minute. Integrated planning, I would suggest that you consider co-owning sales and operation planning and integrated business planning with the supply chain. And your working capital is your inventory, receivables, and payables. It's effectively what's going to help you better manage your cash-to-cash cycle time. When I talked about financial visibility, I want to go a little bit deeper here. I think of it as there are 5 connected layers. The first layer is what I call your data foundation, where you want to connect your enterprise resource planning data, your ERP, your transportation and warehouse management, and production and procurement data into a single cost ledger. So everybody understands you've got all the pieces together. Think of putting together your unit cost in what I call a total delivered cost model. Some people use the term landed cost. So you're taking your unit cost plus any inbound freight, plus any duties or tariffs, which are pretty relevant today, storage costs and outbound freight. It's like that holistic view of cost. Your product line and customer P&Ls, that's essentially your gross margin minus the total delivered cost. And this is where activity-based costing comes in a lot. Supplier cost profiles. When you're helping your procurement teams, I recommend you use what's called should cost models. This is where you can actually develop a model of what your supplier's cost should be to make the materials that you need and any impacts of trade terms. And finally, and this might actually be the most important one, this is what I call decision support models. When you're doing trade-off analysis or when you're helping the supply chain make trade-off analysis, whether it's a make versus buy, a sourcing optimization, your different profiles, be sure that your decision support models reflect reality. So, and in that, this is the thing that I want you to keep in mind. Oftentimes, your supply chain team will come to you in finance and ask for product cost. What they don't know always how to ask for the right type of cost, and this is where you come into play with all of your knowledge of cost behavior. So what I strongly recommend is that you be sure that you understand what decision that the supply chain is trying to make. Based on that decision, you identify the right cost type to use, whether it's variable cost, marginal cost, full absorption costs. Again, it all depends on these decisions. And so the better that you understand what the supply chain is trying to achieve, the more effective you can be helping them to make the right decisions based on your knowledge of finance and cost behaviors. And that's going to result in incredibly better business performance. So again, the challenges, this is kind of, I'm getting close to summing up here. So the first, financial planning analysis challenge is data alignment. So when you're developing financial forecasts, are you using the same data that supply chain is using? Again, think back to those planning horizons and the fact that data is being aggregated at different levels. And finally, do your decision support models really reflect operational reality? Where have you taken shortcuts to approximate results? A lot of times, you've got an obligation in the finance organization to follow generally accepted accounting principles. I get that. But at the end of the day, in an operating, environment, you've got to understand these trade-offs. So think about, I keep emphasizing this, how well do you understand these trade-off decisions that the ops team has to make and the financial implications? That's going to make you have so much opportunity to really be an effective partner to drive performance rather than sitting back and kind of evaluating things after the fact, which there's value in that too. But at the end of the day, if you want to become a really strategic partner and you want to really help drive the performance of the business instead of just being the person, looking at things after the fact, keep in mind that this is a thing. So I've got a few suggested actions. One is learn the end-to-end flow. Remember when I gave that definition of supply chain? Understand that flow from suppliers all the way through the end users. And make sure that your finance team members have first-hand knowledge. And you get that by walking the process, asking good questions. The best financial people that I've ever worked with are the ones that are the most curious. You want to understand how things work. Understand these supply chain performance goals, because that's what's going to help you to bring your knowledge and your expertise to the party and really drive that business performance. So this leads up to our last Q&A question, or continuing ed question. When making short-term capacity,
No, go ahead.
Allocation decisions, which cost type should finance use to give to supply chain? Should it be full absorption? Should it be variable marginal cost? Should it be incremental full cost? Or should it be activity-based? So what are your thoughts based on what I just shared?
And while our participants answer the question, we have some really good questions that have come in the chat.
Okay.
I wanted so one is a comment from Kenneth Darlin. It's also very important to distinguish between PM and delay time. Not quite sure what PM is, but that was on an early.
Yeah, that's preventive maintenance. So that's,
okay.
We don't. I would not recommend preventive maintenance to be tracked as delay. Delay is once you set up to actually make production, and then the line has to stop. That's delay time. But good question though. That's clarifying that.
Yeah. Anna is asking, in your experience, what best hastens collaboration between finance and supply chain management, and what makes it more difficult? What can speed it up and what makes it more difficult?
Here's, again, based on my experience, what speeds it up is leadership. In other words, your finance leaders and your operational leaders, if the more that they can come together and agree that we want to help each other and we have a shared goal, and that's to improve the performance of the business, that will go tons and tons of time reduction in order to get things happening. If you don't get that cooperation, that's going to take a long time. And in fact, when I wrap up and give my last thoughts here, one of the things you're going to see is one of the things that I consider a financial lever is what I call performance management. And this is where, in fact, are we at a point where we can skip ahead?
Yeah. We have now 72%. Giving you 10 more seconds, please, to answer.
Okay.
Otherwise, so we have 72% of attendees right now who have answered.
Yep.
All right.
And most of them got the what I could consider to be the right answer. Use variable marginal cost, because that's what really changes as a result of the decision. In other words, these other things are, again, they're valuable cost data to know. But when it comes to that specific decision you need to make, that's the number you need to give your supply chain. In fact, a lot of supply chains will have optimization capabilities in their systems, and they need to load the right cost information. That's when they'll come to you asking for cost data, and you give them the right data, goes a long way. So coming back to these levers, I'm going to focus again on this bottom layer. Cost optimization, make sure that you've got the right data at the right time to make trade-off decisions. Again, you need to understand these input. risk management, you need to understand the implications of product quality and trading terms. Again, don't assume the lowest purchase cost is the best for the organization. And finally, performance management is the one on the lower right-hand side. And this is where I would suggest that you work to align internal performance metrics to eliminate, where possible, conflicting objectives. I've seen so many times where operations teams and sales teams and finance teams are at odds with one another because each of them has a particular metric that they're trying to achieve. And for everybody to achieve their individual metric, it's a win-lose situation. Somebody's going to win and somebody's going to lose. And that's what causes fights in organizations. And the more you can help steer your culture to find these conflicting objectives and harmonize them so that they're much more supportive, you'll go a long way to achieving the results you're looking for. So with that said, again, I understand that in many ways today's presentation has been a little bit like taking a drink of water from a fire hose. It's a lot. And as we said, there is a topic for more discussion in the roundtable discussion. It's actually scheduled for June 17th. And Deborah and the SIG performance site can give more details on that. So thank you again.
Yeah, Bill, I just wanted to share with you two comments we received. Okay. One from Brad mentioning that this was an extremely important topic, that he really liked it. And then we have another participant, Alan, who even asked you if you could do a longer presentation on this in a different session. So I want to say to everyone, as Bill just mentioned, join our roundtable on June 17th. The link of that will be posted on the Performance Management SIG page. And I will mention it. I will do a LinkedIn post on this and I will mention it there. Again, thank you everyone for participating today. And I for sure enjoyed myself and I hope you did too. And thank you, Bill.
One last thing, Deborah. I am on LinkedIn. So if people want to connect with me on LinkedIn, they certainly can find me there and send questions my way. And I am available from a consulting basis as well. So I appreciate people who are interested in more information, but what I've done today was crammed about 4 semesters worth of supply chain material into 1 hour. So anyway, thanks again, everyone, for participating.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.